I've talked to probably some of you over time, and you've carried some of the story really over the last more than 2 years with Metro's financial situation. And we are indeed at a crossroads with our transportation financing and the services that we provide here in King County with our transportation system. In the face of continued demand increase, growing demand, growing need of our public here in King County to take transit, we're facing the potential of service reductions. In 2012, we carried about 115 million riders on Metro service. In October, we peaked at about 400,000 daily boardings. We're very near our 2008 pre-recession ridership high. Again, in fact, 2012 was the second highest ridership in Metro's history. As jobs are coming back in King County, as the recession recedes and economic growth continues in the county, jobs and transit go together. People need to find ways to get to work. People need to be able to move around and have good mobility in King County. King County jobs grew about 3.5% last year. Metro ridership was up at about 2.5%. Our ridership tends to follow employment. When our ridership went down during the recession, it went down actually a little bit less than employment loss, and now employment's coming back, so too is ridership. In fact, the Puget Sound Regional Council, a couple of years ago, when they issued their Transportation 2040 plan, their forecast of what the transportation environment and needs of the 4 counties needs to look like, by 2040, they forecasted a need to nearly double transit ridership to keep this county moving and keep economic growth moving apace. In Seattle, some 2/3 of Seattle's 200,000 daily commuters don't drive. 43% of those daily commuters take public transit, Metro buses, Sound Transit, community transit, and so forth. It really makes the downtown Seattle environment work. Downtown Seattle cannot build enough parking garages and parking lots to accommodate the growth in employment that is forecasted and people want to see happen. Unfortunately, bus service cuts are on the horizon again. 2 years ago, we worked very closely with the state legislature and eventually with the county council to talk about what is a chronic structural imbalance in Metro's budget caused by the recession. We're primarily funded by sales tax. That sales tax declined substantially between 2008 and 2010 at a level that was unprecedented, certainly in our history. We will not be back to our previous sales tax levels yet for a few more years. And at the same time, inflation has increased our costs. Demands on our service continues to grow. In 2011, the state legislature granted King County authority to raise a congestion reduction charge, a $20 per car congestion reduction charge. That was sunsetted as only a 2-year bridge funding tool. The county council imposed that tool in the summer of 2011 after a very significant outpouring of public support and testimony at council hearings. That $20 CRC, congestion reduction charge, expires in June of next year after 2 years. That will have raised about $52 million to help bridge the gap, along with the residual reserve cash that we've been using to keep service on the road. During this time, as a result of the recession, our primary priority, the primary priority of the King County Executive, the King County Council, Metro Transit, has been to keep the service on the road for as long as possible. Our gap between expenses and revenues is about $1.2 billion through 2013. We found means to raise about $726 million to keep service on the road. That's a combination of fare increases. We've raised the fare 80%, the base fare, since 2008. Staff reductions, productivity improvements, using one-time cash from our reserves, reducing our capital program to basically bare bones. In your briefing packet is a chart that outlines some of the specifics of all the things that we've done to generate that $726 million in measures to keep service on the road. That's also yielding about $145 million in ongoing savings and revenue to keep the service on the road. The hole in our budget is about $75 million. That's $60 million to keep service on the road and another $15 million a year to buy replacement buses for buses that are at the end of their useful life already. We have buses on the road or will be on the road that will be more like 14 and 15 years old. We should be retiring those buses when they're 12 and 13 years old. Old buses mean, first of all, equipment that is not up to snuff for customers, but more importantly, starts to cost a lot more money to maintain as the various different systems begin to fail. So today, we are releasing this report. This report is in your packet. This is our annual route performance report. King County Council last year directed King County Metro to submit this report on April 1st, today. We're taking the opportunity of using this report to also outline, using our objective and what we believe are transparent criteria, on if we have to reduce our system by 17% next year after the CRC expires, what those reductions might look like. And we'll be talking about that some more. What you can see behind me are illustrations, and I'll get into that a little bit. The guidelines report are based on the new strategic plan that the County Council adopted in the summer of 2011. And as part of that strategic plan, we created new, fairly complicated, but we think very objective guidelines for where and how to add service, where and how to reduce service, given the financial situation at any given time. If you look on page 20, you don't have to look now, but as you're doing your research, starting on page 20 is a description of what our service needs are right now, consistent with our guidelines. So as I said before, ridership's been increasing in the county now for 3 years, and we forecast continued demand pressure on our system as the economy continues to expand. Per our guidelines, consistent with these guidelines, we actually should be increasing our system by 10% right now. That's what you can see starting on page 20, that description. That is pouring more resources into what we would consider underserved corridors, given the characteristics around those corridors in terms of population, residential characteristics, and their connections to various different job centers throughout King County. As well, investments we would need to improve the quality of service in terms of both reliability and overcrowding on the system. Unfortunately, the economy has not been strong enough over the last couple of years to restore the very significant drop in revenue that was caused by the recession. And that has caused the structural gap of approximately $75 million. So what we're facing right now is based on the initial analysis. The initial analysis contained in this report and outlined in this report is a reduction of about 600,000 hours of service, or 17% of the system. Now, what does that mean? In point of fact, based on the guidelines, up to 65 bus routes would be at risk of being discontinued outright. 65 routes. Those would be routes that fall in the bottom 25th percentile of service productivity. Service productivity via our guidelines is based on ridership per hour and ridership per mile, and then some other factors associated with the characteristics, the density and demographic characteristics along those particular corridors. Those 65 routes fall within the bottom 25th percentile. Now, mind you, that's a relative. That's all relative. Those are just the lowest performing routes. That, of course, does not mean that people don't use those routes. A lot of people do, in fact, use those routes. Unfortunately, however, again, consistent with our guidelines, only about half of the 600,000 hour reduction could we take from that lower 25th percentile. The other routes that the guidelines would not suggest we would discontinue need to still be there to keep at least one route connecting centers and some other factors that are outlined in the guidelines. Therefore, about half of the reductions would have to come from the routes that are above the bottom 25th percentile. So another approximately 86%, another approximately 86 routes would also potentially be reduced. That would mean less frequent service, fewer buses on the route during the course of the day, meaning longer waits, or the buses would end earlier at night or start later in the morning. In other words, ultimately that means we're reducing some access to the system. Now, the analysis is based on data. We collect data from our routes, the reliability, performance data, as well as the loading data. And incidentally, this report is based on ridership from the spring of last year. We'll be doing an update later this year, we believe, to have more recent data, which will probably show more crowded services as ridership has continued to increase. What are the impacts on our customers? What's the impact on King County? Well, we have over 200 bus routes in the system, in a highly integrated system. About 40% of our customers have to transfer to complete their trips. So if we're discontinuing up to 65 routes and making reductions on perhaps 86 other routes, the impacts on the system and on users, on our customers, cascades. Certainly people who lose their routes, excuse me, certainly people who lose their routes altogether, that's a pretty direct impact. Certainly people who see less frequent service and less span of service during the course of the day, excuse me, have a direct impact. But what that also means is people might have to walk to a different route. And those routes where we may not be making reductions, our heavy corridor services, are now going to have to take on even more people, both metro routes and sound transit routes, by the way. So those routes are going to be more crowded. So you may be on a route now that may not be targeted for a reduction, but more people may be needing to access your route, and therefore that route's going to become more crowded going forward. We're estimating that approximately 70% of our system is going to be affected by a 17% reduction because of those cascading impacts of a highly integrated system. That also means we're going to lose a lot of ridership. People who are transit dependent, who are going to lose access to the service, they're going to have to find a route. They're going to have to walk further. They might have to take another transfer. Invariably, their service is going to take longer. It's going to be less convenient to use. Other people who have a choice that can drive may just say, I'm not going to try transit anymore. This doesn't work for me anymore. I'm going to start having to drive again. And they will reluctantly leave using transit and move on to something else, which we believe, particularly in the context of a growing economy and growing jobs in King County, that this will place more and more pressure on the state, on the region's highways and arterials. They're already very crowded by traffic. Now, the scenario that we're playing out is the first glimpse of what a service reduction of this magnitude might look like. We've got to prepare for that possibility. It takes us a fair amount of time to start identifying candidates for service reduction and potentially service restructure. Therefore, we will start, unless we get relief from the legislature in this legislative session, we would start in the fall with very detailed public outreach and public participation on looking at these types of potential reductions and potentially some ideas to restructure the system, restructure the network, which could therefore lessen some of the impact on the services. So these illustrations of potential service reductions do not include service restructures at this point. Now, I will point out, and some of you covered the story in the fall. On September 29th, we made probably the biggest and most complicated service change in Metro's history, making changes to something like 50 routes very significantly and another 30 routes a little less significantly. What we were doing is moving resources around. It wasn't a net reduction in the system. We took some service hours from lesser productivity routes and put those resources where we thought that they could be used better. But we were robbing Peter to pay Paul. We were just taking away from where some services are used well and other services that we think can help people more. But there was quite a bit of public comment on that. And there are a lot of people that were left out in the cold. So there's going to have to be a lot more public participation. Without new authority from the state of Washington, King County Metro Transit can't raise any more money. We are at our statutory limit on monies that Metro can raise, 0.9% sales tax. In that sense, we're a creature of the state government in terms of our ability to raise new money. They provided the congestion reduction charge, and we're asking the state now to find a more permanent and sustainable solution to Metro Transit's chronic funding problems. And as I pointed out, sustainability is not only keeping the current service on the road, but it's also ultimately we're going to have to figure out a way to grow. in order to meet the very strong demands on the community.